So, hello everyone, it's me, Andy Wilson, as usual, if you've been here before, for The Traveller in the Evening, which is my Substack blog, Substack thing, which is normally talking about Blake. This week, we're going to be talking about Cornelius Castoriadis, and that's might be a bit left field for some of the people who are here because of Blake, but believe me, our job tonight is to try and make some connection between this character, Castoriadis, and William Blake. And to help me with that, I've got my Facebook friend here, Stephen Hastings-King, Hastings-King, I think, who I know from Facebook, but I knew before that as the author of the book Looking for the Proletariat, Socialism, Barbarie, and the Problem of Worker Writing. And I'm sure we'll touch on that at some point. But that really was a book about Castoriadis's activist group of certainly of the 60s, the late 50s too, I think, Stephen?
Late 40s to 66 or 7.
Right, so it's very much an activist group. And again, I'll say more about that myself in a moment. I noticed that, Stephen, I haven't had a chance to read this because I only noticed it today. You're the author of an essay on the Marxist imaginary and the problem of practice. Again, the word imaginary coming in. This is our point of connection between Castoriadis and Blake. And I also believe, have I got the name right, that you are involved in some kind of consultancy called the Pattern Recognition Research Collective. Is that right?
Yes.
Terrific. Again, maybe raise that later, but I was reading a paper that Stephen wrote in that guise about the necessity or the central role of education in a democracy, and it's a very, very kind of Castoriadist idea. So again, maybe more of that later. What I thought I'd do, though, before I kick into my first question for Stephen, is just briefly tell people about this character Castoriadis. Now, some of you, even if you only think you'd ever read was The Traveller in the Evening, some of you would know something about Castoriadis because I did a meeting with Joe Ruffell. In fact, it was exactly a year ago, August 2024. I recorded a podcast with Joe precisely about Castoriadis and the imaginary, actually, but it was a kind of first pass over the problem. But for those of you who don't know Castoriadis at all, a brief recapitulation of his career / life story. Castoriadis was primarily, I would say, a militant coming from a Marxist background, born in 1922 in Constantinople. I think emigrated almost immediately. His family emigrated to Athens. That's where Castoriadis grew up, and he was very soon involved in politics, joining the Communist Party at the age of 15 or something like that, and fairly quickly joining the Communist Youth Movement and then the Communist Party, I should say. But fairly quickly he moves on to become a Trotskyist, who are, as you'll know, are left critics of the Stalinized communist parties of that time. Being a Trotskyist in the group that Castoriadis was in Athens in the 1940s, was a pretty dangerous way of going about things because, you know, they were revolutionary defeatists. They were calling for the defeat of Greece in the war, and that got them into trouble with everybody, both the government and the Communist Party. So it was a pretty dangerous role, actually, being a Trotskyist in Greece at the time. Castoriadis left for Paris when did he go to Paris, Stephen? Do you remember?
44.
Right. So he moved to Paris and he immediately joined the Trotskyist group, the LCI. People who are listening to this thinking of Trotskyist groups as like their local militant or socialist workers' party. The PCI at that time was a tiny group, but it was a pretty impressive one, actually. There were quite a number of serious syndicalist leaders who joined it. You know, many of the Trotskyist groups around the world were formed out of Zinovievites, actually. Really, and they had a whole bureaucratic cast of mind. But the French party had, like I say, a number of syndicalists, leading syndicalists in it, the French Trotskyist party, I mean, the PCI, and they gave it a certain workerist cast that certainly Castoriadis picked up on. You know, that's the sort of workerism that he was to develop for the rest of his years as an activist. But nevertheless, he soon broke with the Trotskyists as well on the question of the class nature of Russia. So briefly, the Trotskyist classical position developed by Trotsky was that Russia was a, quote, degenerated workers' state, unquote. Now, nobody among the Trotskyists and their periphery disagreed that Russia was degenerated. Okay, everybody could happily agree about that. But the point of Trotsky's analysis wasn't that it was degenerated, which we already knew. The point of his analysis was that it nevertheless remained a workers' state. So the Trotskyist belief was that the Russia that they knew in the 40s, under Stalin, after enduring massive deportations, the mass executions, all the rest of the history of Stalinism, they nevertheless thought of it as a workers' state, albeit degenerated. And Castoriadis split with them on that basis, I think. Maybe Stephen want to comment if there's probably more to it than that, but that was the nub of the matter, was that he began to develop an analysis of Russia as a kind of bureaucratic capitalism, I think is what he called it. And if you know anything about Trotskyism here in Britain, the dominant group on the far left for many years were the Socialist Workers' Party, and their distant forebearers, the International Socialists back in the 50s, had a state capitalist analysis of Russia, and they had broken with Trotskyism on a very similar basis, and were in fact had some connection with the British supporters of Castoriadis. In this country, they were called Solidarity and led by a couple of people, Maurice Brinton, also known as Chris Pallis, and Ken Weller. One very much a worker militant, the other one very much an intellectual, I think, be fair to describe them. But they actually were invited to join the editorial board of International Socialism, the state capitalist body. And I think they did for a short period of time. I don't know what their contribution was, but I believe they did join for a while. So what I'm saying is, if you're trying to understand where Castoriadis was coming from, his position was not unlike that of the forerunners of today's SWP, in that he rejected that Russia was in any way a workers' state. He thought it was capitalist, and therefore, for example, didn't need defending. In the event of a confrontation between typically America and Russia, the assumption of the Trotskyists was that Russia had to be defended at all costs because it remained a workers' state. That was not the assumption of Castoriadis or the state capitalists. So on that basis, Castoriadis began to, now again, I'll ask Stephen questions about this, but having split with the Trotskyists, having formed his group Socialisme ou Barbarie, socialism or barbarism, a quote from Rosa Luxemburg, I think, it was very much a workers and a workerist organisation. Castoriadis began to develop his analysis of capitalism, at which creation was at the centre of the analysis. And very briefly, what it meant was that he believed workers created things and bosses and managers didn't, but they needed the input of workers to produce. So there was this constant struggle between the need of management to pretend that they were in control, but at the same time to harness the workers' creativity. I won't say anything more about it, except to say that means that philosophically, Castoriadis was increasingly centering on the notion of this creation as being at the heart of the class struggle, so to say. The rest of Castoriadis' story I'll tell very briefly because, throughout the 70s and 80s, he kept on writing. He broke increasingly with Marxism until he finally rejected it altogether as historical materialism. I would characterise him as a post-Marxist, but I know that some people don't like that formulation. But I think his Marxism informs what he does later, even after he's broken with it. So I think it's fair to call him a post-Marxist. And the only other thing I'll say is he got a job at the OECD. He was an economist for them for many, many years. And by the way, that means that while he was working for them, he had to write under a pseudonym. So you'll find him, actually, most of the things he wrote under a pseudonym, I think he wrote as Paul Cardan. But that and a couple of other names, that is explained by the fact that he was working for the OECD and he had to keep his head down. He didn't have full citizenship, so he could have been, ousted. But anyway, I think that really sums up what I need to say about Castoriadis at this point. So I'm sorry for the long digression, everyone, but I thought, for many listeners, most listeners, I suspect, it's worth just setting the scene of the kind of guy that Castoriadis was. Now, to throw it over to you, Stephen, I wasn't sure where to start, and I kind of thought, although I want to talk about the imagination, because that to me is the point of contact with William Blake, it might be an idea to start with the political project of autonomy that Castoriadis had. And to explain it fully, I think we have to then move on to talk about the imagination. But I think it's probably a clearer place to start from, because people will understand what is involved in a political program of pursuing autonomy. So, I mean, we all have some idea of what autonomy means, but Castoriadis has a very specific idea. So, Stephen, to kick off, tell us about this project of autonomy, and as much length as you like. I know there's a lot to say about it.
Well, thanks for having me. And it spins out of the project of autonomy, spins out of his interest in direct democracy, which in turn kind of spins out of his interest in direct democratic worker councils, which he connected. Essentially, he saw the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 as the kind of culmination of a mounting wave of what he was calling autonomous worker activity. Autonomous worker activity was essentially workers, wildcat strikes, workers who were mobilizing across sectors, across outside of union control, often against union control, often against union wishes, primarily because in exchange for collective bargaining arrangements, the unions typically gave up input into the speed and organization and ultimately safety of industrial production. So mobilizations that had to do with any of those issues tended to happen outside of union control. They would tend to happen amongst skilled workers as opposed to line workers, because the semi-skilled workers, their primary worker source in terms of writing for Socialisme, Barbarie, which is a journal and a group, just to be confusing, was a machinist at the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, just outside of Paris, the biggest car factory in France at the time. And the machinists had their work pace was slow, and there was slower and more collectively oriented, but they were under constant pressure to submit to rationalization and sort of speed ups and stuff. But in any event, and essentially the way they saw the mobilizations working is that they were the expressions of and the unfolding of the political implications of shop floor solidarity amongst workers that essentially treated skill as a collective attribute. Kind of interesting. And when they would go out, they would start to perform the political implications. When they would go out on strike, there was a tendency of these actions to adopt direct democratic forms of organization. And that was the point of departure for thinking about councils and that form of self-organization. Like I said, they collaged together a bunch of strike actions from about 1953 to 56 that they saw as international, transnational. They tended to see Eastern European worker actions as being ahead of Western European worker actions and American actions, because they were involved with bureaucratic capitalism, which is more advanced than Western capitalism in that respect, according to the kind of teleological history that they were using to orient the idea of revolutionary theory. And they saw this culminating with Hungary. So Castoriadis had written a series of 3 essays on what he called on the content of socialism that were specifically about those stages of the project. The worker self-organization at the point of production, the sort of tendency to went on autonomous strikes to organize in councils, and then Hungary. And Hungary was on the content of socialism too, is this giant essay about trying to theorize what a society comprised of interlocked worker councils would look like and how it would operate. And then the final installment, just 58, is a kind of worker critical sociology of worker struggles at the point of production in advanced capitalist industry as of 1958. That interest in direct democracy persisted across various permutations of socialism, Barbarie, and then the break with Marxism. And it became one of the structuring, probably the kind of guiding thread of the political project after Marxism. So it's after Marxism revolutionary theory. So after Socialisme, Barbarie breaks down, and he was working on it. It did sort of surface within the imaginary institution of society. It's essentially, project of autonomy is about people individually and people collectively giving themselves the law, making the law under which they operate. So, autonomos, giving themselves their own law. The political paradigm for it is direct democracy. I like to think of it as a regulative idea. For individuals, it's essentially, he aligned it with psychoanalytic practice and the sort of maximizing the balance between, individual autonomy, like the maximizing balance between conscious and unconsciousness. And that's essentially the outline of the project, how it got there and what it ended up meaning. And we can maybe just talk through steps from here.
I'm sort of familiar with what you said, but from the point of view of like thinking about rank and file groups in this country, where you had the shop floor begin to organise itself, obviously in opposition to management, but also independently of union structures, often working through them, but operating independently, being able to take their own decisions and then draw the conclusions from that. So they would be spreading, wildcat strikes and things like that. They'd be the people doing the picketing. So there's a whole phase of sort of radical workerism as part of the labour movement generally, and clearly socialism, Barbarie and Castoriadis were at the centre of that kind of trend in France. And we should say, for the interest of listeners, that other people involved in socialism, Barbarie, included Guy Debord, who went on to become a founder of the lettrist movement and the Situationist International, Situationists. But also Jean-Francois Lyotard, I think, was a member. So that's the kind of thing they were involved with. But what I wanted to pass on to was, as Castoriadis tries to extend that developing sense of autonomy, both individual and collective autonomy as a social ideal, he starts to develop a whole theory around this based on his understanding of ancient Greece and describing different kinds of societies in which this autonomy either was not or wasn't possible. So heteronymous societies or otherwise. So I'd like you to say a bit more about this more the generalization into theory that he makes of his interest in autonomy.
Okay, I'm going to back up first up, if that's okay. One of the things, just to go back to the Trotskyist period, Castoriadis was lined up almost immediately with Claude Lefort, and they're kind of famously associated with each other for the rest of their lives, whether they liked it or not, through a kind of a tumultuous on-off friendship. They were operating in Trotskyism in the general context of a kind of legitimation problem for concerning where theory was supposed to come from, because Trotsky had been killed. And you kind of wonder what the whole movement would have been like had Trotsky not been killed, but that's a short-lived parlor game. But nonetheless, the other people in the group, besides Lefort and Castoriadis, Henri Simons, a fairly well-known anarchist, he just died. There is a Lyotard, Pierre Squerie, who's scholar of China. There's, Motet, Jacques Gautrat was their worker, and he very much was their worker with a capital W. He became a fairly well-known industrial sociologist with a position at the CNRS. I got to meet a bunch of these people. It was really kind of crazy 2 years. When I was writing my dissertation, interviewed them, had to pass certain tests. So, Castoriadis after, I'm going to pivot now, I guess. After Socialisme, Barbarie, I can't remember when he started writing about Greece, or Athens in particular, Athenian democracy. What seemed to interest him primarily about Athens was the fact of democracy itself, and it's the invention of democracy, and also that philosophy and democracy emerge at the same time. And so I think that he's continuously interested in practice, practice, process, and sort of socialization. One of those main points about Athens, is that, like, for example, the direct democracy the fact that you set one up doesn't really solve all the problems. That you have to essentially, through the process of participation as citizens in a democratic formation, you become socialized into being able to function in that kind of environment. So democracies are a temporal process. They're processes. They're temporal. They unfold in time, across time. He also saw Athens as basically giving it, autonomous after the Cleistinian reforms. I can't remember the year, 5th century. 4th, 5th century BCE. They were giving themselves their own law. They had a mechanism for hedging, which you could someone could bring suit if the polis had passed a law and somebody say it served them. It was excessively in someone's personal self-interest that this law was passed or something like that. There was a edit function almost. So they did not believe themselves to be perfect. So they had a mechanism for reconsidering. And they would also try, he saw Athens as an exceedingly creative period. We had a society that was changing itself in quite fundamental ways at a remarkable speed. And he makes the case in this, the Greek imaginary seminars, simply by attending to chronology. So people who I thought were quite far apart time-wise, like Anaximander and Parmenides and Plato, are actually very close. And he uses, and like the main tragedians are really very close to each other. So it's like happening very, very quickly. So he has a remarkable essay comparing a play of Aeschylus to a play of Sophocles and trying to get at what he calls underlying significations, which we'll inevitably have to talk about. But what it is, the underlying patterns, that assumptions or patterns of referrals that enable society to hold itself together and define it as what it is at that time, and not something else is the usual way in which you would put it. So he sees, he aligns this direct democracy, autonomy with creativity. An emergent of creativity is sort of like a sort of surging forth of the imagination, collective imagination. And the democracy is really about the rendering determinate, things that he talks about as being magmatic prior to that. Magma is it's a kind of reservoir of potentials for what a collective can think or say and articulate about itself and about its world. That and this rendering determinate or rendering formalizing as a kind of an institute.
My understanding is that there's, in a sense, two sides to Castoriadis's description of the process. There's the kind of the originary imaginative bit, which is a collective but through individuals, the creation of something new, ex nihilo, okay? But there's also the instituted imaginary. And in a sense, the two are relating to each other. And I'm quite interested in how Castoriadis saw that working. And I'll tell you why I think that. I think there's at least an analogy here with something in William Blake, where he says in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I can't remember it exactly, but he says reason is the limit or outward bound of energy. And that's how he defines reason. So it's a reification of energy, so to say. And in that way of depicting it, everything really is energy. It's just that reason is a reified version of it, but energy is the real thing, if you know what I mean. And I saw an element of that in what Castoriadis was saying here. You've got the imagination, the energy, in a sense, bursting forth from the human collective, and then it's captured in the instituted imaginary. But what I thought about that was, in the Blakean version, it may just be a prejudice of mine, but I'm persuaded to think that when people exercise the imagination, they often don't even recognize it when they see it, or even when they see it in other people, because if it doesn't fit into what they expect. What I'm trying to say is I think more people have visions than know that they do, because the experience, if they have it, is just not part of the, if you like, the instituted version. It's not actually instituted, but the kind of social imaginary that they are working with. And so, in a sense, for the imagination to take hold, it has to somehow connect with the instituted, reified aspect of itself. I see that as a problem for Blakeans to explain how that works in Blake. I'm wondering how Castoriadis addressed that problem when describing the process of autonomy.
I took advantage of our previous conversation to look at The Marriage of Heaven and Hell a few times, quite a piece. I hadn't read it for a very long time. It was a real pleasure to go back to it. And I don't have it in my head verbatim, but there's a lot of interesting parallels between how Blake speaks in that piece and what Castoriadis is doing. One of which had to do with the inability of the so-called good to recognize the imagination. So that, They thought that it was, madness. They thought they aligned creativity and desire with the devil. So they align. So they can't. It's in Castoriadis' language. I mean, this would be the inability of a heteronymous society to recognize the fact of its own auto-institution. The fact that it institutes itself, that it creates itself. And the problem there is that the heteronomy is essentially an extension of determinism at the ontological level. It's a way of processing the world as if the world was fully determined. Meanings in here and the objects themselves and sets of, and they're given, they're found, they're not made. It's and he said that he talked about the heteronomy and the determinist thinking being necessary. He lines it up with mathematics, with the physical sciences, and it's everywhere. He talks about it as being everywhere dense, and so it's in some sense, it's a tension between autonomy and heteronomy is constant, but the heteronomy has a lot of advantages to it, and you have a similar and it also has certain misrecognition. It brings certain inabilities to recognize. So the good being unable to recognize profits or creativity or energy because they associate it with the devil, and then they think that the way in which it looks is in some sense demonic, because that's how they interpret what it is that they're seeing. I mean, it's right there. It's right there at the beginning of Marriage of Heaven and Hell. I thought it very interesting. And the other thing, he's also a bit like there is no desire without imagination, which is in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It's also in Aristotle, and it's also an important thing for Castoriadis. In some sense, that the imagination, the imaginary is the unspoken sets of preconditions that enable things like desire, that enable communication. And Blake he proceeds to talk about, he doesn't talk about institutions so much, but he has this sort of dynamic, plus minus dynamics that he's sort of interested in laying out, equal and opposed things that sort of balancing energy.
I have a huge argument with the Blake world about this, because I think there's a real tendency to read into Blake that he talks about contraries and negations, and the world is all contraries, good and evil, love and hate and whatever, but negations, they're not negations. And I can't remember his exact words, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that the Blagosphere, as I call it, as a whole, has decided that this means that Blake wasn't into unpleasantness or negation of any kind. And I think quite the opposite. And I think what he says is quite compatible with quite the opposite. But I would say first that I'm quietly very struck by the overlap between Blake and Castoriadis. I think what Castoriadis says about the social imaginary and in a similar way, the instituted imaginary, is very much like what Blake says about Eurism. So Blake says Eurism, reason, okay, is he talks about the starry wheels, things turning in. And I always think about like Ptolemaic mathematics and, these perfect circles, everything. By confining everything to what it knows, to its circles, it stops reality happening. I mean, it is the ontologically, it's the management compared to the workers. It's the guy who wants there to be no imagination. In other words, wants everything to be perfectly predictable and therefore manageable, versus those who know what creation consists of. So I think I find quite deep connections. And I suppose one of the things I want to explore is because I find what Castoriadis says about autonomy, to the extent that I understand it, and by that I don't mean that it's difficult. It just means I haven't read enough, because I haven't read that much. But from what I understand it, I kind of get this idea of the ideal of autonomy is that you're self-created. You're not bound by somebody else's rules, basically. And I think there's a trivial sense, not necessarily that trivial, but a straightforward sense of reading that. It means that, there's an old anarchist jokes about, if you want to know who rules you, ask who is it that you can't speak badly of, right? That's who rules you. In an analogous way, you're free when you can speak badly of anything. So everything is up for grabs. Nothing is taken for granted. I mean, I think we all get that as a sort of ideal. What would thought be like without that, really? I mean, in a sense, it's the essence of thought. It's the essence of philosophy, is that it be unbounded. However, I don't recognise Castoriadis' historical description of that. I find it, nobody's going to earn friends by going to bat against the idea that the Greeks invented a lot of stuff and were a fabulously inventive society in the classic period. Of course they were, but the idea of a kind of, that world had unconstrained thought, and then that possibility emerges again more recently, but the period in between is a period of darkness. It just sounds too much to me like the kind of aristocratic, Hellenophilia, the idea that there were the enlightened, open Greeks, and that tradition was extinguished by Christianity, from which we are now emerging on the other side towards the light. I just think it reflects a lot of that attitude, and I don't know how much it matches the historical facts. We're not going to sort that out now between the two of us, but my point is how much does it really depend on that interpretation of history? Because I don't think it does really. I think that's a bit interesting but extraneous to the argument.
There are several things. One of which is some trucks went by. So I didn't hear some of what you said, so I'm going to go with what I just based right now, what I heard. Okay, there's two or three things. One, the uniqueness of the Athenian invention of democracy. He spent a lot of his time trying to get people to not take that as in a way that he didn't want it to be taken. So it wasn't so much that there's any superiority to the Athenian people. It's just that they embarked on this adventure and they created these things. And it could have happened in any number of other places, but it didn't. And so it's unique without being blessed. You know what I mean? It's not like a chosen.
I have to throw in that I was very struck by the fact he named his children Sparta and Cybele. Cybele being the goddess whose priests had to castrate themselves. I thought it was kind of, if you're going to channel Greece, they're kind of odd choices, Sparta and Cybele.
I met Castoriadis. I worked with him for a couple of years, and I was with he kept lending me his stuff from his archive, which was incredibly generous and risk-taking, because he would let me take the stuff out of his apartment and make photocopies. And he had a remarkably complete archive, because I came to realize that he understood his world historical importance quite early on. So he kept all of his papers. But in any event, I mean, like in the later interviews, you can see, I mean, he has to fend off this idea that he is somehow or another an aristocratic Hellenophile, like consistently. It's like, because I've been reading around a bunch of stuff lately, and actually I almost end up feeling badly for the guy, because you can sort of see him almost thinking, "Oh shit, this again." On the other hand, it does come out of an aspect of his work. I mean, it's not like it's just bizarre. You would do this. It's just that he just couldn't make it go away, and I think he would have really preferred to have made it go away. The thing is, like, if you think about how a society institutes itself, I mean, there is the instituting, which is the bringing into determination. The sort of what he talks about, the creating of new forms, the creating of new meanings, but it's always constrained by the instituted, that the things that have been previously brought into determination, right? And these can include, very dense rules for conduct, inclusions, exclusions. These exclusions are always a problem. The other reasons why he was really tired of people taking. This goes back to the previous topic for a second. He was really tired of people taking Athens as some sort of model, even though he said no, and himself as a sort of aristocratic Hellenophile, which he tried to distance himself from. Was it Athenian democracy was as characterized by its exclusions as it was by its inclusions, and these exclusions are, particularly from a modern viewpoint, pretty problematic, because it's like women. It sat atop a slave society. He never pretended that those weren't problems. But not, and that's also why what he was looking at with Athens was not a model, but we call it germ, something that was kind of a spark, something that would kind of spark his thinking about stuff. So when you talk about an institution, it's a dynamic that links the instituting and the instituted, where there's a tendency, and especially in a more heteronymous societies, to allow the instituted to supplant or erase the instituting. So one of the things in the product of autonomy is essentially trying to bring these two dimensions into a kind of a lucid balance. And in that respect, he was also always emphasized, not always, but he emphasizes a lot in his work the absolute need for self-limitation. Democracies do not have a priori limits placed on them, but that means that the problem of limitation becomes theirs. And so a lot of his work on Athenian democracy is focused on their navigation of that problem of self-limitation. How far can we go? Can we do what constitutes too much? And that includes also managing consequences of action. Because if you assume that you are yourself part of a collective that is continually creating itself anew, you'll project history as a kind of alteration in a sort of strong sense. I mean, it's change, yeah? And if you take a decision now and apply it in a situation that's altering, you're not going to be able to predict a lot of the consequences. And so the decision doesn't, in effect, stop. I mean, it loses some of its discreteness. It's more, the deciding things is more putting something into motion and then having to kind of track and adjust and perhaps go back on things if the outcomes in this changing future are not symmetrical to what you were hoping they would be.
I really like what you said about let's call it the germ aspect, that seeing what happened in Athens as the germ of something rather than an ideal as such. And let's not go into it, but I probably got the wrong impression because I was having quite a debate with the Castoriadis translator, David Ames Curtis, this week, where his sort of, and again, I don't want to attribute views to him that he doesn't have, but it seemed to me that what he was arguing was that there was this Athenian type situation, but then the rise of Christianity had put an end to that because Christianity has a premise that it will not negotiate over, which is, the existence of God. So, and that this rules it out as a possible, participant in any real autonomy. And I just thought it was a bit of a red herring argument anyway, to be honest, when we were having it. And I think what you've said makes much more sense. I mean, what it led me to think about, however, was the picture that was implicit in what David was saying, which is that on the one hand, you have systems of thought that have premises and which are in a sense not temporary premises, right? It's not just that they're premises. So on the other hand, you have systems of thought in which you do have premises, but you kind of know what they are and they themselves are up for grabs. And I just don't find that plausible. I just don't think that you can ever get to the bottom of thinking like that. I think any way of thought, any form of life is going to have premises which, in a sense, I mean, they can change, but they're not negotiable, if that makes sense. They're not something you reflect on and change, I mean, if the opinions if the worldview of medieval Christianity couldn't change, then how did it change, so to say? But again, I'm beginning to think, that's a bit of a red herring, so I don't really want to deep dive into it with you. But what I would like to do is press on because I think that in my introduction, although I asserted that there were connections between Blake and Castoriadis, I think that I didn't assert it enough, and I didn't explain what some of them were. One thing, actually, in what you were saying about Castoriadis keeping all his papers, or understanding that he was of world historic significance, or however you put it, that's very Blakean as well. I find, as well as being a small fellow, pugnacious and pug-nosed and querulous. And, Blake said, voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. And I think that Castoriadis often speaks with that voice. So, and Blake too thought that his work and that he was of great significance, and he was right about that too. But apart from the personal similarities, I think the imagination is the thing that really I think is so important, because Castoriadis reflects philosophically on the history of the imagination. And my impression is that sort of what he says is that Aristotle in De Anima highlights the imagination as something that is neither perception nor reason. And he says something like it is what gives us the image, the imagination. And Castoriadis takes it ultimately to mean that the imagination is the sort of prime mover of thought. It's that which is not determined, and therefore is a kind of philosophical abomination, which is why it isn't often recognized for what it is as the prime mover of thought, because that would be to undermine philosophy itself. And so he says that appears, again, sort of in Kant temporarily and later in Heidegger, and I'm sure other people. I think of Coleridge with this idea of the isoplasm, debate he had with Wordsworth, where Wordsworth thought the imagination was fancy. It was the ability to reorganize in a kind of empiricist sort of way, to reorganize the contents of your impressions, whereas for Coleridge, it was actually generative of form. So that's a kind of philosophical analysis. But what I think it reflects is a view of the imagination that is as radical as Blake's, and I think in a similar way. But how similar, I'm not sure of yet. So I throw it back to you to say, how do you see that? Is my impression of how the imagination is important to Castoriadis broadly right?
A lot in there. I'm kind of tempted to go back to some of the interaction with David. I'll see if I forget to do that or not. There's an essay called The Discovery of the Imagination that goes through his take on Aristotle. And he says that when he does talk about the imagination, he does it in what he calls the sort of two senses. The sense in which it's, fantasy, the ability to make stuff up. And then there's the other sense in which it's the thing that enables people to function. It's the unspoken. It refers to the unspoken, unformalizable dimension on which those things that are formalized depend. So it's elusive, but it's fundamental. It's the unspoken that permeates the spoken, in a sense. He argues that it's pretty much suppressed in Western philosophy. He said that the question of it comes up in Kant's Critique of Judgment in the way in the section where he talks about the work of art as act of genius, as sort of like the sort of surging forth of the undetermined and the sort of creation of new determinations. And then it kind of goes away again. And then he sees it coming up again via Heidegger in his lectures on Kant. And then he says, and then Heidegger runs away from it as well. Really doesn't like Heidegger. Just as an aside, I think one of the main reasons he doesn't like Heidegger is because Heidegger doesn't speak Greek, but he didn't speak Greek, but he pretended he did. And geez, boy, oh boy, did that piss Castoriadis off.
So that's just a fact that Heidegger couldn't speak Greek, is that right?
Yeah, but he pretended he did. So he would get really worked up about it. Actually, kind of funny, because he's not translating, line from Parmenides into German. He's translating it into Heidegger, and then so it comes up in his. And then Castoriadis is interested in some sense reshaping or relaunching philosophy as an activity around the recognition of the imagination, and that sets into motion his really active. How to say it sets into motion the kind of aspects of his philosophical writing that cause him to also distance what he's doing from interpretation and hermeneutics. I mean, he's very kind of aggressively constructing dialogue rather than to tease out something else, rather than trying to reconstitute what's already there. When he takes on a lot of the texts that he takes on, and sometimes it's really fascinating outcomes. So I'll leave that for a moment and go back to the thing with David, just to sort of see if I can remember. I don't know, man. Well, first off, before the conversion of Constantine, there were lots of Christianities, right? There were different variants of it. There were just doctrinal disagreements. And one of the main doctrinal disagreements, as I recall, was not everybody thought original sin was coherent. So not everybody bought it. After the conversion of Constantine, we've got the formalization of Christianity as a doctrine that's amenable to being used as a bureaucratic state in order to help, fuse with the state in order to help with the whole project of governing. Original sin is much more useful. And so the city of God, there's a remarkable thing in Augustine about justification of the notion of original sin. But apparently, if I understand it, Arians don't think the original sin made any sense at all. And if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong about this, I don't think Byzantine Christianity accepts original sin. And that explains the whole tradition of icons, because what follows from the rejection of original sin is a notion of human perfectibility. So it's an interesting thing, because now and here I'm not sure if I'm blurring the conversation we had in with the conversation you're having with David or not. But if you imagine human beings through a prism that's shaped by the assumption of original sin, a lot of what they're going to end up being like, the idea that you would let these fallen venal horrible things govern themselves without a foundation would seem to be really unappealing. You need rules because but you need rules from someplace else because of the fact of the fallen nature of human beings, which doesn't really exist unless you accept the notion of original sin. I think it makes perfect sense that you would arrive at that conclusion if you see things through that assumption.
Yeah, I want to come back just because I want to say that I have a lot of agreement with what you said, but I want to also assert whether I think there's a key difference. Is I certainly agree that whether it's the case that the doctrine of original sin is just there because it supports, the bureaucratic state or whatever. I just don't know enough about the history of that. But what I would say is I'm absolutely prepared to believe any story about, how the church, as it impacted and was impacted by its partial fusion with the state. So, after the Edict of Milan or whatever it was, which makes Christianity the state religion, I don't know how to formulate my thought on this precisely enough to avoid all kinds of, rancor with other people. But essentially something is going wrong at that point. And there are all kinds of distortions happen as a result of that. However, I think the picture we're given at the end of all that is a bit lopsided, and I'll just take up one aspect of what you said about original sin and the Arians. What the Arians believed was that Christ was created by God, but not of God, not of one substance, as they say at Nicaea. So he's basically human, but God, or whatever. Which seems kind of realistic, but what it challenges is what was at stake when the bureaucrats decided on the kind of Nicene formulation about, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost being of one substance as the formulation has it. But it's interesting what was at stake because you talked about the perfectibility of man from that point of view, but actually from the opposite point of view, that's what they were defending, because what the Arian point of view reflects is actually a kind of Platonic thinking that was very much around at the time in Alexandria and the places, which said that God is utterly ineffable. And if God is utterly ineffable, he can't appear in this world. And that's why Christ cannot actually be God, because God is utterly ineffable. And in a funny way, what drove the debate was not ontology, but the belief of, the majority that when you commune with Christ, you commune with God. And if Christ is less than God, then you're not communing with God, and God remains ineffable. So for them, it was part of the perfection of mankind that they could become godlike in unity with Christ, but only by rejecting Arianism. Now, we don't need to relitigate the Council of Nicaea, but the point is that I think there are many ways of telling the story, and I think all the sensible ways of telling the story will include aspects to which, the church, the more it got involved with state power, the less it became like a Christian church should have been. You can certainly argue that, but at the same time, behind all of that, we have this. Let's get on to the really interesting stuff, which is about autonomy, freedom of thought, and imagination.
My temperament, and by training, I'm a historian, and I've been thinking about this. Castoriadis located himself in philosophy, and I think David locates himself in the same way, which inclines people to try to jump toward things that are universal. Whereas as a historian, your approach can be much more relativistic. Like you could still find the social imaginary to be a really useful part of an interest, how to say this, like a part of a toolbox that you can use to decipher all kinds of things without having to necessarily use it in the search for the invariants or transhistorical invariants that sort of move across giant swatches of human experience. It's like, for example, when Castoriadis, in his later work, talks about the social imaginary signification that sort of shapes capitalism. It's the unlimited expansion of rational mastery. And it's true enough, but it gives you an idea of just the elevation, the nuts and bolts of things. It's useful to have that in mind. In certain circumstances, it's good to be able to refer to it. When I had this paper that I'm finishing where it has a section about the inability of people to figure out what to do faced with climate change. And one of the explanations, like collaged in, because I thought it was kind of perfect, was that the fact of climate change shows that the unlimited expansion of rational mastery has been turning into its opposite, and that this is completely undermining for the dominant capitalist imaginary. It's a point that I probably wouldn't have been able to get to myself had it not been for the highly abstractified way in which Castoriadis in his later work talked about capitalism. But I think it's the looking for things that are universal that actually leads him to that abstraction. But as a historian, there's somebody who's inclined to think that way. I mean, that search for abstraction and sort of invariance is an interesting. It's more than a parlor game, but it is a parlor game. But you don't necessarily. You can play other games and find the same tools to be equally or more interesting for what you're trying to do. In other words.
Yeah, I think I'm probably personally inclined towards the philosophical, as you put it, but I also understand that what the danger is involved in that. But, as soon as I got arguing with David, I'm like trying to assert this other thing. I'm aware of what you're saying, but I do think my interest in that particular debate was just to do with what I think is to do with the dominant social imaginary, which is the world that I was brought up in and what it says about, the Middle Ages. I put a challenge on Facebook this week. What's that meme where a guy is sat behind a table and says, "Convince me," And I said, the church was right to say that Galileo hadn't scientifically proven heliocentrism. Prove me wrong. And I knew what I was going to get, which was a load of people saying, one guy actually came in and did a huge diatribe about the flat earth, right? Why it can easily be proven that we don't live on a flat earth. And I had to point out to him that nobody believed that at the time of Galileo. No one in the church. It was just not considered a sensible opinion. But the point is that this kind of wave of secularism that we face, we have in the culture, it produces this kind of thing where people shout loudly in defense of science about things they know nothing about. I kind of stick bending towards a kind of, church explanation, apart from the fact that I'm a Christian, but I kind of really bend the stick about, the upside, what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, in this case, what did the church ever do for us? Well, actually quite a lot, really. And my interest in it is because, for example, November the 5th, we continued to burn Catholics, right? The whole story about Galileo, the first episode, the first version of it was written by Milton. It's part of the Reformation is to tell this story about the Dark Ages, the superstitious, ignorant church and its brutality. So part of my interest in kicking back is not so much about ticking a universalist box about what is right and what is wrong, but actually just kicking back against the dominant social imaginary and the image that our society has of itself as enlightened, right? The other side of that is the image we have of the society that preceded it. Before the modern world really arises, you have the Middle Ages and the dominance of the church. So the church is dark to the extent that we're light. That's been quite important to me of late because I felt like it was like emerging into the light, actually, to repeat the sort of metaphor, to realise that a lot of what we think about our own history is nonsense. But anyway, that's a minor point. I want us to click back to just the stuff about imagination, because we've talked about, I suppose, how radical is the concept in Castoriadis. And I've said it's similarly radical to Blake and possibly a similar concept. But one thing we probably haven't communicated and is hard for me to communicate is when I say that's radical, it's the ramifications of it, right? Which you can see. It means that deterministic history must be wrong if this view of the imagination is right. It means Marxism and historical materialism must be wrong. It means that how we think of scientific knowledge today must be wrong. And it also means that we need a completely different society in order to put those things right. But that's my very sort of newspaper headline way of putting it. Well, I'll throw it open to you to perhaps fill some of the detail in, maybe.
First off, I'm right in the middle of two or three different things that have preoccupied me with what you're saying. One is I look at Marxism, the workers' movement, together as a social imaginary formation with a discrete history that actually also experienced a fairly discrete, long, slow death. I think that we are in a period after the Marxist imaginary. I think that people haven't quite come to terms with this still, because they confuse Marx as a body of text with Marxism as one of the conceptual backbones, political backbones for the entire workers' movement from late 1848 onward, to varying degrees in various places, different levels of impact in different places, depending upon the translation history of Marx, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With, Soviet Dimat, unbelievable perversion of it, but I still like to think about because of the category of the Hitler or Trotskyite wrecker, but that would be a digression. The saboteur, the insect, in the history of invective, one of my favorites. But I think, I think that the Marxist imaginary was essentially taken down by its own internal dissonances, and I think the Hungarian Revolution is one of the big surfacing moments for those internal dissonances. And I think that Chris Marker's film, The Fond de la Rouge, or translated as Grim Without a Cat, is a remarkable history from about the mid-'60s onward of the deterioration of the Marxist imaginary up until the Euro-communist phase, the early 80s and stuff. But by the time you get to the explicit implosion of the East, of the Soviet Eastern Europe and Berlin and Moscow in 91, it's over. The problem with that is, one of them is the extent to which capitalism was made infinitely more humane because of its terror of the left. It also it also relied for its vision of a future different from the present on the existence of the sphere of the left. The lives of working people were made considerably better because of the achievements of the workers' movement, which operated in general under the political umbrella of the Marxist imaginary. Capitalism cannot see itself, except thanks to a feedback loop that is outside of itself, that is in opposition to itself. And we see the problems now, because right now, since the implosion of the Marxist imaginary, there has been nothing to take its place. There's been nothing but vacuum on the left, that's concealed sometimes by periods of infighting amongst people on the internet about this or that geopolitical formation, which you got a lesson just how degenerate things could be if you're involved with people around the Syrian revolution. Nothing to take it the third way, people instantiating neoliberalism at the center of the capitalist sort of imaginary, even though it was nothing but assertions from the beginning, on claiming that there was an evidence-based way forward to ground an economic ideology that was never evidence-based, etc. I think that this is the inability of people politically to come to terms with the Marxist imaginary is one of the background conditions that we would look at to explain contemporary neo-fascism, which comes out of the dominant neoliberal inability to see themselves in what they're doing, and this tendencies to self-enclosure at the administrative level, etc. So, the Marxist imaginary, I think, was a huge humanizing factor for Western capitalism, despite all the things that people talk about when they talk about it as instituted and as it was instituted under Stalin or under Mao, or the problems that Dimat caused, or the Dimat was used to justify in the Soviet Union, for example. It doesn't obviate all of Marxism, but the collapse of the Marxist imaginary kind of does. What do we do with Marx at this point? I still find some of his work to be kind of inspiring, but I wouldn't call myself a Marxist, because I don't know in 2025 what that means. I do know people in various academic circles who maintain a relationship to Marxism, which makes of it a comfortable language game that they use for purposes of professional differentiation and self-identification, and competitions for symbolic capital in various academic contexts. And they sometimes get together and congratulate themselves at conferences about how terribly radical they are. I have a piece called After the Future that essentially tries to lay out the consequences of the collapse of the Marxist imaginary. And that left behind basically only accounting time. And accounting time is the future is the same as the present, except with details rearranged. That's the monotony of the world in which we are. That's what I say to be the dominant imaginary, especially from the point of view of the United States, because the dominant formation, even I think, is finance. I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand finance and financialization and basically using a lot of the toolkit derived from Castoriadis to do it. And with the strange consequence that one of the things, and Curtis has said this in one of his introductions, that one of the problems for Castoriadis' reception of his work, which I think is immensely generative, is that it doesn't really lend itself to much meta-criticism. I mean, in the U.S., theory is largely regarded as a self-referential activity. Castoriadis' work is much more conducive to seeing through it rather than talking about it. Using it to sort of like explicate or elucidate different phenomena that are happening. Like we have this idea of the cognitive geography of finance. That it would be difficult for me to get to were I not sort of steeped in this Castoriadis kind of approach, right? Because certainly, as talking about the cognitive geography of finance has nothing to do with its own claims made about itself or how it tries to justify itself, but it does give me a way of talking about what it excludes, and what it excludes is typically all the non-financial consequences of financial decisions. So, and the fact that that's even possible for people to simultaneously participate in that, but see themselves as ethical. The fact of the power of the imagination, the power of the social imaginary, to sort of keep things in focus and keep things excluded out.
There's so much to talk about, and I say this after so many of our podcasts that I wish we had more time, but I'm not just saying it, mostly I get people to come back and talk some more, so that, I think we were just getting to touch on some really meaty stuff about the Marxist imaginary, for example. I mean, I wanted to say a couple of things before we wind up. One is that, you spoke about the sort of financial imaginary, for example, and about the Marxist imaginary, and the kind of philosopher in me, excuse me, is interested in, again, we're not going to have time to drill into this, but is interested in the extent to which all these separate, so apparently imaginaries, are just manifestations of one great big complex topographically structure that incorporates all of these different imaginaries into one social totality or something like that. And what they all have in common, I think it was right for Castoriadis to say that the Russian formation was bureaucratic capitalism, because that emphasized what it had in common with the West as well as where it differed, the bureaucratic bit. But there were commonalities. When it comes to the Marxist imaginary, I think you're absolutely right. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I grew up as a Marxist activist. I was a full-timer for a Trotskyist group. I was expelled from them, but that's never the end of the story with these kind of things. I remain debating with former friends and people I recruited to the Trotskyist movement 40 years ago. I still talk to some of them, and these are live issues. But what struck me, or one of the many things that struck me about that, was that the group I'd belonged to was state capitalists, and this had always been an important part of my idea of what Marxism, real revolutionary Marxism, was. So in other words, it had this analysis of Russia, that it was essentially capitalist. And the standard book in our tradition about that was Tony Cliff's book, State Capitalism in Russia. But what I found really persuasive about that was the final chapters, which described how Russia might collapse through nationalism and this, that, and the combination of things. Basically, it would be very messy. But what really struck me was that when it happened, in 89 and around then, and all those regimes began to collapse, the state capitalists got nothing out of that. The fact that they'd predicted it even, or that they'd never, some of them, many Trotskyists, of course, had illusions in Russia, but certainly people like Castoriadis didn't, and the state capitalists didn't. Nevertheless, they suffered hugely as a result of the collapse of the East. And that was because of the deep connection between the Marxist imaginary as a whole and the East. Not just the fact that Eastern Europeans weren't going to talk to anybody who thought that, Russia was great. That was never going to happen. But here too, the problem was that even the tradition I was in, which saw itself as in opposition to Russia, really shared a Bolshevik imaginary. That's the importance of Trotsky, is that he's Lenin without Stalinism, if you know what I mean, within that imaginary. So that all collapsed as well. But you raised a really interesting question too of, comes after the Marxist imaginary, nothing yet. I've been thinking recently about hauntology, which hasn't impressed me at all, but this idea that we're haunted by the ghost of Marx, as Derrida had it. I'm sure that's true at one level, but I find it deeply problematic at another. What I'd like to finish on is this thought, talking about the contradictions of Stalinism or of the Marxist imaginary and so on. Back when Stalin was doing the Popular Front, he instructed, all of the local communist parties to not go on and on about Russia and Marxism, but to find their own unique radical traditions within their own history. This would be good for the Popular Front. And in this country, it was the Communist Historians Group, the likes of E.P. Thompson and others, who dug out the left wing of the English Civil War. So the people like the ranters, obviously the diggers and the levellers, but even further on, the ranters. I see Blake very much as a ranter. So what I want to say is that if you wanted to go beyond the Marxist imaginary, it turned out that the old Communist Party hacks, historians, they were hacks politically. Some of them were excellent, brilliant historians, But nevertheless, they thought you could look to an alternate kind of tradition, which is connected with the ranters. And I would say people like Blake. So that's just me finishing our discussion by telling people, if you came to this discussion knowing about Castoriadis, but not Blake, that's my pitch to you as to why you should think about Blake. I think there's stuff in there which would help us overcome, the Marxist imaginary. I think with the help of Castoriadis and what he has to offer, because one of my great bugbears is that within the Blake world, people see Blake's imagination as arts and crafts. I want them to understand that it's the imagination to rethink the world. And so with that thought, I'd like to thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us today. It was immensely interesting. I thoroughly recommend your book on socialism at Barbarie to people who are interested in workerism, which I think was the most exciting thing about the left movement of the post-war years, was this workerist trend, and socialism Barbarie were key movers within that. So do look into that. But to everybody else, as I always say at this point in the program, however you came across this podcast, and by the way, listeners, I think Substack have changed the way they distribute the podcast or changed the way they count it, because there seem to be many, many listeners there's thousands of listeners actually to this podcast these days. And so I hope their new system of counting is working. I mean, that's true. But I would like to say to you, if that's the case, you're probably not listening to the podcast via the Substack itself, but through some distributed system on Apple or wherever it is. And in those circumstances, I'd like to encourage you to come and find The Traveller in the Evening on Substack. If you search for those things, you'll find me, where you will find, along with this podcast, notes and images to support the podcast, links to books that have been mentioned, links to Stephen's work, links to Castoriadis' work, and all sorts of other supporting material. So with that said, thanks once again, Stephen, and thanks to everyone for listening in.
Thanks very much.